But these are the forms we're going to go over today. You know, we have a class where we spend a whole hour on the lease itself, and I fly through it and we go through paragraph and paragraph, and we try to talk with real life examples. If you guys are representing tenants or landlords, one thing I will start with is that the Texas Realtors Association has most of our promulgated forms here around leases. The form that they have for us, the residential lease form, here, I'll just show it to you, as a general rule, is very landlord friendly. So let me pull it up. Residential lease. I'll just show it to you. We're not going to go through it, but this form, the Texas Realtors residential lease form, is a super landlord friendly form. And I highly, highly encourage you, when you are representing landlords and tenants, to please make sure that they actually read the document. Like, I know that sounds crazy. They may not read a contract because they're trusting you when they're buying or selling something to guide them through the process. The lease they need to read. They're going to be bound by its terms for a year, and it affects the way that they live. So both parties need to read it. I think most people probably don't, but that's my first piece of advice. If you're representing a buyer or a tenant or a landlord, is to advise them to read the lease. If you're working with a very sophisticated landlord, they may have their own lease form that they use, and they don't use this one. Although I think this is a really good form. I'm a landlord. I use this form because, like I said, it's very landlord friendly. Okay, I think I beat that horse to death. So we'll get going on our addendums. Like I said, we have 9 that we want to cover. So the first one we'll go through. First of all, does anyone have any specific questions about this? Things that they're looking to learn? Oh, hey, Blake, if you want CE credit, put your name and license number into the chat, okay? Actually remember your license number because it's such an easy one. Is how to get you guys paid, which is the agreement between brokers. So in a lease, typically, it's advertised in the MLS, or maybe you or your client found it on Zillow, and then you have to fill this out regardless about how you're going to get paid, because the other piece is that it talks about what happens if the tenant agrees to buy the property from the landlord. Typically, no one's getting paid anything, but if you're a listing broker and you think that that might happen, you may want to protect yourself when you fill out your listing agreement and provide that if the tenant buys the property from the landlord, that you would get a commission, you could facilitate the sale. So, you just put the property, and then whatever they've advertised in the MLS, it's, it depends on what market you're in. It's usually 25 to 50% of one full month's rent is the commission paid. And then, again, if you're going to get paid on renewals, typically speaking, this is a no and this is a no, unless the person who's listing the property has negotiated for that with the landlord. And you just submit this, and you also have to submit your W-9 to the listing broker, because they're going to just write a check directly to you. So if Laura has a lease listing and someone from Allie Beth brings the tenant, they're going to send this document together with Allie Beth's current W-9 so that Briggs Freeman can cut a check directly to Allie Beth, who will then pay their agent. Any questions about this one? It's pretty straightforward. Just to be aware that when you're taking a lease listing, these are things to discuss. Is, am I going to get paid if you want me to do the renewal form, which we'll go over what the extension looks like. And if you sell to the tenant, like, can I facilitate it for you? And would you pay me like 1% of the sales price, or $5,000, or whatever that might be?
Okay. You did say something that triggered me, Zareen, is
What's
about
that?
Zillow. And because my experience with Zillow leads is nobody will pay.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so here's the deal. I'm glad you asked that question. So right now, our MLS does not syndicate lease listings to Zillow, although it automatically syndicates sale listings to Zillow. So if you take a lease listing and you can put it in the MLS, but my recommendation, and sorry, this is how as a landlord, and if you want to get the property leased, I put the property in Zillow as well. And last time I did it, it changes all the time. It was $29 for 30 days. And then it renewed if I didn't extend it, but I uploaded the pictures and I described the property. And then I just say this house is going to be open the next weekend on Sunday from 1 to 2. And I take a bunch of lease applications and I sit there and I try to get tenants that way directly. As the listing broker, then you'll get both sides of the commission, which makes a lease more worth your while. and you get the chance to meet the tenant. Of course, I'm the landlord, so I like to meet the tenant. Your landlord may want to come and be at the open house with you so that they can meet the tenant, right? I'm not answering your question yet, Laura, but I will. So that's how I like to do it. I think you need to know that lease listings don't automatically syndicate to Zillow. You're going to have to pay extra for them to be. And with respect to, you're saying if you find a lease available on Zillow and then and it's like a property manager, it's not in the MLS and they're not willing to pay you, it goes back to our buyer tenant rep agreement that says the tenant will pay you. Does that answer your question, Laura?
Yeah, it's just, those are the harder ones.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. So before you show it to them, it's the same thing we were talking about yesterday in Turtle Creek with sales. Like before you show them a property that's not in the MLS, you can say to them, it doesn't look like I talked to this landlord. We can go see the property. They're not going to pay my commission, which means that you'd be responsible for what we agreed to in our buyer tenant rep agreement outside of what you're going to have to pay the landlord.
Yeah, I
That's
agree.
how it goes. Yeah. Good question. Christine,
Okay,
did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Okay, so you send over that, the agreement between brokers. What do you do? What do y'all do if they don't sign it? Like it was an MLS. And I mean, what do you suggest? You just keep badgering them until they sign it? The broker signs it?
Like it's the listing.
It's the listing broker.
And it's probably typically you're in this situation. It's not like you can call the manager because they're their like own broker. I mean, if they don't sign it, they don't sign it. If they've advertised that amount, the question is, are they going to pay you?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So that's the question.
Okay.
And if they're like, yeah, we pay on move-in, like the MLS says, or we
Right,
pay
right.
whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of the same thing with the seller's disclosure. Like the point is making the disclosure. If we can't get them to sign it, like as long as we can prove we've delivered it, it is what it is.
Okay.
If something, the agreement between brokers is, I don't know why we need it necessarily if it's in the MLS, but
Yeah.
that's how we do it.
Okay. All right. Well,
question.
let's keep badgering. Thanks.
No, it's good. The questions are good because you guys are in the trenches. Okay, so the next one I'm going to show you is the extension of the residential lease, because that's probably, well, no,
Hey,
the
Marie,
residential
before we move on,
Yeah.
that W9, is it in ReChat? Like I found the ABB in ReChat, but where do I find the W9 for the
the W9 will be in BF office. I'll send you guys a follow-up email with the answers to all of these questions. So these are good questions, just so that you have it at your fingertips when you actually need it. How about that?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the residential lease application. And this is just another form. This is what I said when I host my little Zillow open house. I print like 10 copies of these and go and sit there for an hour and then hand them out to people, and it will feel like everyone wants to apply. And then you end up getting like 1 or 2 applications. Everyone's like, I love every time, which is fine because you just want to get one good applicant, right? But they fill in all of this. You can fill in this information and have it printed out. So I usually have it filled in the property address, what the rent would be, what the security deposit would be. And then that they have viewed the property because they're picking it up for me in person. And then they can fill the rest of it out. Anyone over the age of 18 who is going to live in the property, I recommend getting one of these for. Now, if you have a lease listing and you want to screen the tenants, Briggs Freeman recommends that you use My Smart Move, which is like a website. And basically the landlord can handle it so that they get the information about the tenant and they can decide. The last thing you want as the agent is to be the one who like, oh, I screened the tenant for you and they look great. And then they're like total deadbeats, right? So as much of that burden of making the decision and evaluating the tenant that we can put on the landlord is better. So My Smart Move is fantastic for that. Now with My Smart Move, they're going to take a lot of the questions asked here and input it online. So this document might feel a little bit redundant, but I still think as a landlord, it's helpful to have this information about the people who are living on your property. So I collect it. Email, work phone, social security, driver's license, all of these things, their current address where they live, their employer. You can call and verify all of these things if you want, or the landlord can really. And then, what cars are they going to have there? What kind of pets do they have there? And then, will all of these things, you need to make sure they check the right boxes. So questions. I'm going through this one kind of quickly, but basically it's a 4-page form. Note here that it says that the property remains available for lease. So until you have a fully executed lease, like you can continue to show it. And then this is an important one, the tenant selection criteria. So when I print out these, I also print out a copy of our tenant selection criteria, which you can also find in BF Office if you just search at the top tenant selection criteria. This, if you give the reason, the tenants, the criteria on which they're going to be evaluated, and you make them pay to apply and they don't pass, then that's on them, right? You told them what they were going to be screened on and they didn't meet those criteria. I have heard, I don't know if this is true, but I think this is true, that if you screen them and don't approve them and you haven't given them the criteria upon which they're going to be evaluated, that they can ask for a refund of their application fee. So just be aware of that. We do have a tenant selection criteria form. It's very basic. Every landlord could have their own if they wanted. I'm sure ours came from a template. I created it a while ago. So any questions about this? Like I said, it's my recommendation. They sign at the back that they're authorizing you to really screen them, do whatever you need to do, or they're going to authorize. I would put the landlord here, unless you're doing the screening, which I do not recommend because I don't want that liability on you guys if the tenant turns out to be bad. So
quick question.
Yeah.
So the My Smart Move, is that credit as well as background? Like how much screening is that doing?
I think you can go in there and look. And what I always say, so here's the deal. When you're representing a landlord, we obviously aim to be like full service, but at the same time, if someone's choosing to be a landlord and we are not property managers, like they're going to have to be like somewhat involved and proactive, and they can't be like total ostriches about how this whole process works. Like they're going to have to figure it out. So what I would do is when you take the listing, say, when we get applicants, I'm going to recommend that you screen them through My Smart Move. So I'm going to encourage you to go to this website and look through it and just understand how it works. You can say, I'll help you do it, but you need to understand also, because they're going to have being a landlord is a big responsibility and they need to understand that. So I'll send you guys that website too, so you can kind of poke through it and look. I think you have choices and then it just depends on the cost.
It does, you have choices, I can tell you. You've got
Yeah,
multiple choices, and then you can also have the applicant pay for it online, so you don't even have to take money.
That's what's nicest about it, is that the applicant pays directly in My Smart Move for the application. And so you're not like collecting money and running credit and like doing all of these things. It just eliminates us as the middleman in terms of collecting funds for the application, as well as actually evaluating the tenant. Thank you, Laura. Does that help, Chastity?
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Cool.
I
And
had a
again,
quick question on there too. Laura, you might know, because on My Smart Move, it says like tenant score, but I have a hard time finding their exact credit score. Is there a credit score on there you could see, or is that basically the same thing as their credit score? Because I believe that's different, right?
No, okay. When you get My Smart Move and the applicant comes back, it comes back with the credit history, the criminal history, any eviction notices, etc. And if you click on the credit, it will show the credit score, and it'll show their line of inquiries and their debts.
Yeah, all the different line work they missed. I just didn't see a credit score.
So let's just say that Blake Christine is your applicant, and she goes on to My Smart Move. She fills out the form, she pays for it. Then you get a notice back from My Smart Move that says the application has been completed. Then you can go back to the dashboard of that application, and then you can click it on, and it'll give you the credit score, and then it'll show you the lines of inquiries, and if there's been any, defaults or bankruptcies, etc. And you can see where they owe money. Is it loans, student loans, bank, medical, all kinds of crap?
I guess like here, for example, it might be hard to see my screen here, but here was like a recent applicant, me and a landlord screened. It just says a resident score at the top. I believe that's different than a credit score, right?
What does it say?
resident score on their
Like
credit when you click on
if I was
credit.
looking at this, I would be less concerned about the actual score and more concerned about like recent payment history. Like, do they have a lot of current defaults and have they defaulted on things recently? Because that indicates that they're like in a shaky financial situation. So the number itself is not as meaningful to me as long as they've been in good standing with everything for a good period of time. Like everyone goes through hard times and maybe didn't do well a while back. But if in the recent history they're current on everything, I think you're okay.
That's what I like to think as well. I just have a lot of landlords, they'll be like, well, what was their credit score? And a lot of them will be like, hey, if they're below, 620, or most apartment complexes will, deny anyone below 550 or 580. So they'll ask me that. I'm like, I'm not sure what that number is exactly if it's not showing that one on there.
Yeah.
Because they want to know that number just in case.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. Okay. Cool. So that's the residential lease application. So now we're going to go over one that you may use if you're representing a landlord. This is hopefully a form you get to use because it means that the tenants are staying and you don't have to go through the whole rigmarole again. It's the extension. So what I would do is I always put a note in my calendar. Like if in my leases, I put that we have to give notice 45 days before, and then they have to stay through the end of the month. So I always put a notice 2 months before the lease ends, like at the beginning of that, the month before it ends, to reach out to them and say, hey, do you want to stay? If so, the rent will be increased to X. Do you want to stay another year? And then we go back and forth. And then I would prepare this document, the extension of the lease. And you basically fill in all this information. You say effective this date. And that's, you can say whenever you're doing it. Like if we were doing this week, I might just put the end of this week. And then I say the expiration date is changed to, a year from the expiration date that was in the lease. And then the monthly rent either stays the same or is increased to what have you. And then if there's any other changes that need to happen, like sometimes you're removing a tenant from the lease or adding someone new or what have you. And then this is the confusing part. So if the tenant does not sign and return this extension on or before this date, then the landlord notifies the tenant that the lease will, increase with its terms on a month-to-month basis, and the rent is now this much. So you can penalize them for not agreeing to extend in writing. So if I have a tenant right now and they're paying $1,600 and I want to raise the rent to $1,700, I can say, if tenant does not sign and return this lease to the landlord on or before December, 5th, landlord notifies tenant that the lease, in accordance with his own terms, will renew on a month-to-month basis, and the monthly rent will be, and I might put $1,900, right? Or $1,800, because I want them to extend for a year at $1,700. But if they want to go month to month, then I'm going to penalize them. Basically, I'm going to charge more for the unpredictability. It might be $1,850, whatever the numbers are. But that's how that works. And then when you send it to tenants, they always get confused because they're like, it says $1,850. And you're like, no, if you look up here in paragraph A, the monthly rent is changed to this. It's only going to increase to that much if you go month to month because you haven't signed this. And that can be effective, if the lease expires on December 31st, then that can be effective January 1. So their next rent payment on January would be the higher amount. Does that make sense? It's a little bit of mental gymnastics, but it's helpful. It kind of entices them to either sign or realize your rent is going up regardless.
I guess I had a quick question there, because I work with a lot of new, smaller investors there. I guess they're new to the process. To help them out could be a good touch point. Maybe put in a reach at 90 days from their tenant's lease is up. Kind of send this to the landlord, be like, hey, might want to send this to your tenants here soon. You send it out, have them send it out. Just kind of a good touch point for them, or just in case they don't know, or that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I mean, it would be super valuable at that point to be like, here's the recent comps. I think you could raise the rent at least $50 or whatever. That I think is a really thoughtful and nice touch for sure.
May I make one other suggestion?
Yeah, please.
If you are representing the tenant and you put them in a lease, I would recommend you put in reach out 6 months in advance to find out if they're going to renew or if they're going to buy. So if they're going to buy, you begin to start the buy process and get the wheels in motion from that perspective, so that you have a potential buyer and you're nurturing the tenant to become a buyer.
Yes. And it might, to be even extra, I love that idea. It's so smart. Partner up with the lender that could say, like, at that monthly payment, if you put this much down, and of course, the numbers are all slightly different depending on people's credit worthiness. You could buy a house in this price range, possibly. I would love to introduce you to a lender and you could talk through the scenarios to see which makes more sense for you. Absolutely. Because sometimes people think it's super expensive to buy and it's really not. Maybe it makes more sense to rent. Makes more sense to buy. Okay. So that's the
I have a
extension.
question. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I have an actual client I'm working with right now whose house we're trying to sell, and it's not really selling, so she's looking to lease the house as well right now. And she wants to put in a clause of like 60 days or 90-day notice at any given time that the tenant has to be out of the house if it decides to sell. So where do we put that clause in there? Would that go in the extension as well, or how would that work?
Well, okay. So what you're talking about, this is a lease that's not written yet, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so you would write that into the actual lease itself. I think you're going to be hard pressed to find a tenant who agrees to that. Just because a house is leased doesn't mean that it can't sell. What it means is that the buyer would buy the house and become the landlord until the lease is up. So it doesn't prevent a house from selling if it's for lease. It just means the buyer has to wait to get into the house. And some places, some people are looking for turnkey rentals, and if it's rented, I don't know the price point, then that's great, right? If you are going to try to draft something like that, your client your client needs an attorney to write that language and insert it there, because we are not attorneys and we can't draft language like that. And even I right now, I'm an attorney and I'm thinking through like what that would really look like and all the different like mechanics, and it feels,
yeah, and it's not even an investment property. It's literally $500,000 townhouse.
yeah,
And they're just having a hard time selling. So she's like, well, let's just rent it. But she wants to put this clause in that at any given time they can sell, but wants to give like a 60-day out to the
but
tenant.
I mean, how much rent would you be asking?
She wants to do $3,400.
Okay, I just think it's going to be hard to find a tenant who can pay $3,400.
I said the same.
So you can tell her, like, we can keep it up for sale, and and what you could also do is do like a 6-month rental, right? And then you can keep it up for sale and just let the buyers know, like, you'll be a landlord because there's 2 months left on this lease. Does that make sense? If you use the residential lease form from the Texas Realtors, like, it's very landlord friendly, and she can show it, and she can take photos, like, there's no problem with that. So, but if you're going to write language in like that, like, let's talk about it, because you can't write that unless you're an attorney. I don't want you guys to get busted for that. We did have an agent get in trouble for practicing law without a license this year. So you got to be careful. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yes, I'll just give it to you later on that for sure.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I don't recommend it. It's going to make it really hard to lease.
I agree. And this is what I told her, but
Yeah. Okay. So residential lease amendment. Okay. So this is different than the extension. This is if you need to change something. You don't use this that much unless, like I said, I had a tenant once where it's like a boyfriend and a girlfriend, and the girlfriend moved out. So we amended the lease to remove her. It was not an extension of the lease. So there's a difference, but there's an extension and there's an amendment. And generally speaking, the extension is pretty straightforward. The amendment is if something changes like during the term of the lease. And it might be the rent, you might say, okay, well, they got a new pet, and so we're increasing the rent, or whatever. You can see they got engaged and their girlfriend, their fiance is moving in, like, who knows? And so this is what this looks like. If the landlord moves and you need to give notice to them of what the legal notice address is, this is just, I just want you guys to be aware of this one. Any questions? Okay. All right. We're breezing through here. Okay, this will be a super popular one. My sister-in-law, I'm in Fort Worth, my sister-in-law is dropping off food, so she's like jumping in the window at me. She's so funny. Okay. Animal agreement. So this used to be the pet agreement. So if you're leasing a property with pets, this is what you're going to add. It used to be called pet agreement. If you have one that says pet agreement, that's the old form. Take it out of your templates and put this one in there. Now it's called animal agreement. And basically you include here what are the agreed upon animals and like the information about them. And we could probably spend the rest of the time and then some talking about assistance animals, which we're not going to do. But I will share the Texas Workforce Commission is the governing body about assistance animals and the fair housing. And I'm going to send you this PowerPoint that they have that explains like all about assistance animals and what constitutes assistance animals and what are the rights and regulations. Under fair housing laws, if someone has an assistance animal that is required because of a medical condition, you cannot not rent to them because of that. You have to make a reasonable accommodation unless it's a high burden of the landlord proving like why they can't make that accommodation.
Okay,
So
can
if
I
you,
ask pardon me, I didn't mean to interrupt. Could
No,
I
no,
ask
no, go ahead.
Can I
Yeah,
ask one quick question?
absolutely.
So I get that you can't rent, but you can still get a non-refundable pet deposit, correct?
Well, no. So you
That's what
can't,
I want clarification on.
yeah, you can't treat the how do I say this? You can't treat the tenant with an assistance animal any differently than you would treat anyone else.
Well, but I'm
So,
saying, okay, but if my landlord is doing a non-refundable for everybody, isn't that the same?
so if the request for reasonable accommodation is accepted by the landlord, no animal fee or pet deposit will be charged. So, an assistance animal is not a pet. So, so it's one thing if you're like, this is my dog, here's my pet deposit, right? I need it. That's how it works. It's another thing if they're like, this is not my pet, this is my assistance animal. Can you make an accommodation for me and allow me to bring this in? And then you can't charge them. That's my understanding. I'll send you this document and you can kind of look through it. There's also a website that Emily Thompson, one of our agents, shared with us called, I can't remember what it's called. It's called Smart Pets or something like that. That's not right.
So
I'll
may
send
I
it.
just recap what I heard you say?
Yes.
What I heard you just say is that for a service animal, I'm gonna call it a service animal, okay, for lack of conversation, okay,
Mhm.
disability or whatever, that you cannot charge a pet deposit.
Well, I mean, you and I are looking at the same language right here. An assistance animal is not a pet.
Okay, I've been charging.
It's so confusing. It's very difficult. It's such a it's the number one, disabilities and complaints around things like this are the number one discriminatory claims under fair housing laws. But I think that's because they're probably pretty easy to identify or improve versus, racism or familial status or whatever. So I'll send you these two things for information. One is a website about assistance animals and one is the actual Texas Workforce's summary. And then you can kind of peruse over it. We can talk through it. If they don't object, it's only a problem if someone says that's not fair. Then you say, oh, sorry, I didn't know. And you give it back to them. But it's pretty clear here. I think if they're saying this is not a pet, this is an assistance animal, so tenant may not keep any animal on the property other than an assistance animal. And then they fill out the information about the animals. And then this paragraph does not apply to assistance animals. So on or before the date, so that's why it's called animal agreement and not pet agreement anymore. They still want you to use this form if it's an assistance animal so that you have this information, but this part is not going to apply if it's an animal, not a pet.
Hey, Zareen, the way
Yeah.
that kind of was taught to look at it is that think of them because they're working, they're like a caregiver, and we wouldn't charge for a caregiver that was coming in home, like a in-home nurse. We wouldn't charge them a deposit or an additional fee because they're actual workers.
That's smart. That's a good way to think about it. These animals are amazing. I follow this animal on this golden retriever on Instagram. He's not an assistance animal, but his name is Cash. I just have to tell you guys about it. His name is Cash, Cache, and it's called Cash Cow Adventures. But he's got one of those mats that like when he presses, it says words, and he literally will have conversations with his like mom. It's crazy. The other day she was crying and he went over and pressed water and sad for like tears because she was crying. It's amazing. He's a good follow, like wholesome social media content. Sorry, I divert, but these animals are amazing. Okay, so this is where you talk about how are they going to pay. So you might have an animal deposit in addition to the security deposit, and then you would check this box and put the amount. I charge $350 per pet. If it becomes burdensome, because I take full first month's rent, security deposit, and pet deposit up front, and that might be a lot of money if they have like 2 pets plus 2 full months rent. So sometimes I will say, okay, well, you can pay the pet deposit in the second month, but you guys have to work that out. The landlord has to decide. Or you can increase the rent, or you can say there's a non-refundable like pet payment or whatever. And then these are the rules about what the tenant must do. Again, I encourage your landlord and tenant both to read these and be familiar with it. Access tenant must remove or confine any animal at any time that the animal is likely to prohibit other people to access the property. And then there's disclosures. You just want to make sure that the dog is, or the animal is not, is safe, hasn't injured anyone. And then this puts, of course, all the liability on the tenant. And then this has an indemnification where the tenant indemnifies the landlord and all of their people from anything that's caused by the act of the animal or the tenant. So any questions about this one? Like I said, I'm going to send you the TCEQ and that website, whose name is eluding me, probably because I can remember dumb things like Instagram, social media accounts. But okay. So what do we have left? Okay, here's one. Early termination. This is something good to talk about. Under our Texas promulgated lease form, let me find this one. Maybe I don't have it open yet. There are very few valid reasons for sorry, I have too many windows open. I only have one screen this morning, which is really challenging me. Okay. There we go. Back to Zoom. Sorry, guys, bear with me. There we go. So under the lease form, there's only very few restricted reasons why a tenant can terminate the lease early. It's not, oh, I have to move because of my job or whatever, unless they're in the military or there's like a sexual harassment reason. I think those are pretty much the only stalking. Those are the only reasons in the lease, and they're in the lease and they're written. So your tenants need to be aware that there are no outs from this document once they sign it, unless it's one of those very clear exceptions. And so then but if the parties agree, this happens sometimes where people do move and your landlord isn't like a total ogre. So you want to talk about like, how are we going to terminate the lease early and come to an agreement in writing. And so then you use this form. And you say on or about this date. So you put the commencement date of the first lease. And then you put the date that they've agreed to terminate early. This is what the tenant's agreeing to do. This is just reiterating what the landlord's allowed to do with the security deposit. This is any fee that you guys have agreed on. So say the tenant's like, I really want out of this lease. Can I sublease it? And the landlord's like, the landlord has a duty to mitigate. So they can't just say, nope, sorry, move out and you have to keep paying me. So the landlord will put it back up for lease. And then so they find a tenant and they're like, okay, well, you're going to have to pay me. And this is in the lease as well, what the tenant will pay the landlord, because you probably have to pay commissions again, right? Because they're asking you to help and you're doing all the work again. So you should get paid. So you're putting in writing what they're going to pay the landlord for the early termination and when it's due. And then it says everyone's released from all liabilities under the lease once they sign this. So this is just to use if the parties do agree to terminate early. This is what this looks like. What's up, Laura?
Okay, so I wanted to bring up a scenario that happened with a fellow agent in our office this year.
Okay.
That had a lease, and I'd love to hear your feedback. So he had a lease. I mean, he represented the tenant, and the tenant had been in there 3 to 4, let's say 3 to 5 months. And all of a sudden, she began getting sick. And it was determined there was a lot of mold in the property. Okay, because it was a pier and beam house. It wasn't being, vented properly, blah, blah, blah. So there were health conditions. What is the landlord's out there? Does that make sense, my question?
Yeah, it's a good question. So while I pull up the lease, so we can look at what the lease actually says, I will tell you, I have a hot take on mold. And this is because we had an issue here at Briggs Freeman. And I called my friend who's a litigator. She does a lot of landlord tenant law and a lot of construction law. And she basically said, here's the deal, Z. She's like, there's mold everywhere. That was her take. As a litigator trying to prove that there's mold, she was like, mold cases are really hard because it's really hard to prove because you're going to find mold everywhere. And some mold is harmful and some mold is not as harmful. And she was like, mold is tricky, was her take. So it's hard to build a case like totally around mold. I understand in this case, it sounds like they had proven that there was really bad mold and she was getting sick. So I'm going to the repair provision of this lease, which is like 17 pages. So if you guys ever take that class, it's like the fastest you'll ever hear me talk, which is saying something because I talk fast, as you guys know. So repairs. So here's the section of the lease. And this is what I would say in that situation. If you had called me about this, Laura, I would be like, well, let's pull up the lease and look at what the 4 corners of the document say. Right. And then if landlord fails to repair a condition that materially affects the health and safety of an ordinary tenant may be entitled to exercise their remedies. If they follow the procedure under those sections, then these are the remedies available to them. Terminate the lease and get a refund, have the condition repaired or remedies or reduct the cost. And then it says, do not exercise these remedies without consulting an attorney or carefully reviewing the procedures. Because the tenant may say like, this mold is making me so sick, I'm going to exercise option 1. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You may not actually have the right to exercise option 1. And again, mold is very tricky.
I get
So,
it. Thank you. I just wanted your take.
Yeah, it's a tough one. That's hard. I mean, this is where like I like to say that I'm like a very fair landlord and I'm always like, what I want to be in this situation as a tenant. My husband tells me that I'm a sucker. But it's a landlord's decision, right? We manage the process and they manage the decision and they have to decide how they want to like go about it. Sometimes when you get someone who's like says a place is making them sick or whatever, it's like, I'm tired of dealing with this person. So I'll let you move out, but this is what it's going to cost you, and in a situation where she's like, well, it shouldn't cost me anything because you're making me sick. That's a gray area. Sorry, I don't know if that's very helpful, but not everything is always black and white. Okay, so early termination. I think that's what we were looking at. So here, did we go through this one? Yes. Okay. So now we're going to go over the residential lease guarantee. So sometimes you're in a situation where it's like college kids or like grandma's paying. I had grandma's paying situation before, which was very sweet. So then I was trying to figure out how to do DocuSign with like these 2 like 20-something old girls and then like 80-year-old grandma, which was interesting. But the guarantee is basically saying like, I don't live there, but it's as if I'm a responsible party on the lease. And what I would do is I took an application from grandma and I ran her credit and she's not named in the lease, but in the lease form, there is a box you can check that residential lease guarantee. You know how all of our forms say these other forms are incorporated and attached. You check that box that this becomes part of the lease and grandma becomes liable and responsible. And it's basically saying who are the landlords, tenants, property, key terms. And then it says if any tenant fails to make any payment, guarantors will upon demand make the payment. And these are, payments for everything. If tenant otherwise breaches, what's up, Christine?
My question on this is, can you have multiple of these lease guarantees? Like say you have college kids and there's 4 parents involved. Can you?
Yep, I would do it.
You would do it. You could take.
I would
them.
do it. I
Okay.
would put everyone, get as many pockets as you can have access to as possible.
And okay,
Hopefully one of them is deep. Yeah, exactly. And I would have everyone make them fill out an application. I think the application is included. Now that I say that, this is the second page of the lease. So you can screen them as well to make sure that they're, credit worthy and have the funds. So, and you can see this one allows for 2 guarantors. So if you had 4 parents, you could probably just have this form twice. Does that make sense?
yes, yeah, it does. Thanks.
Cool. So just so you guys know that this document exists, it's nice that we have all these promulgated forms so we don't have to like reinvent the wheel. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on that unnecessarily, but there's the box to check in the lease. Here, this is the lease form that we're going back to. These are the exceptions for when someone can terminate a lease early: military, family violence, sex offenses, or stalking. Anytime you see that the lease references the property code, it means your landlord, unless they're really good at reading statutes, might want to get an attorney involved.
Zareen, do you run the guarantors through the My Smart Move?
Absolutely. And make them pay for it, for sure. Good question. Okay, so here, this is the section. So you can see all of the things, they need to, if there's a lead-based paint, this is where you check the box for residential lease guarantee. Now we have to disclose about floods. So that should be part of every lease that you sign. And I think the tenant has the right to terminate if they don't get this. So that's a big one. As lease listing agents, this needs to be part of every lease that you sign now. This box should always be checked. But here, so then these are just other forms. We've talked about animal agreement. We're going to talk about this one. If it's before 1978, you got to give them the lead-based paint and tell them not to eat the paint chips. If they have, a landlord has it, this is not a these must all be promulgated forms. I've never used this form. This is just a disclosure. Here's agreement between brokers, landlords, rules and regulations. Sometimes if you're renting something in an HOA, they have different rules for tenants than they do for actual property owners. We used to own a unit at the tower in downtown Fort Worth, and like tenants there are not allowed to have pets, period, no matter what. Even though owner residents are. And the HOA rules provide that any lease that is proposed must be reviewed and approved by the HOA before it can be executed. So just remember that if you get a lease listing in an HOA, you need to make sure that it's A, allowed by the HOA, and B, that they don't have any rules around it or need to review it. And then, if the house has a pool and a spa, you definitely need to include this so that we can talk about who's maintaining it. Then we went over the lease. I always check this box just so that the information they provided there becomes incorporated into the lease. And then bed bug addendum. Thankfully, I'm not familiar with this form. Thank you. Sorry. Okay. So I think I just wanted to show you guys where to incorporate this into the lease, and that's where. Any questions about this? Again, we're looking at the actual lease itself. Okay, so now we're going to go look at this inventory and condition form. And I will tell you that Texas Association of Realtors has one for property managers. Again, we are not property managers, so we should not be filling this out, but you could give it to the landlord to go through and like take inventory of the property before the tenant moves in. So when the tenant moves out, we have like a written record on the landlord side of the condition of the property. Some people, I've been in a property management class before, they said take a quick video as well as filling out this form. So then you have like a video documented, like there wasn't a hole in that wall before or whatever. So that's one way to do it. There's also, property managers, inventory and condition form. And then there's one for, I give it to my tenants. I tell them this is not a repair request. I tell them they have to submit it back to me in 5 days. Like literally the only people who ever do it are like engineers and attorneys. Like most people do not bother to fill this out, but they can fill it out and tell you like what's wrong with the property so that we have in the tenant's words, like what was not working when they moved in so that they don't get charged for fixing it when they moved out. Does that make sense? So it's just a form they can go through. The majority of people do not bother to fill this out, even if you give them the form and tell them when it has to be filled out in the lease. What's up, Christine?
Okay, so if I'm representing the tenants, should I hand them this form when they move in, or should I just assume that the landlord's agent's going to? Like,
Well, so it's addressed in the lease. Well, it's addressed in the lease, I guess, is it at the top of this form where it says that they'll fill it out within X number of days?
yeah, I think
I mean,
so.
the landlord may be like, I don't care, but it's not bad for your tenants to have this and to deliver it so that it's like, I think if there's a lot of things wrong or
Yeah.
things, it's probably a good idea to protect your tenants in that way. The landlord be like, maybe like, what is this? And your tenants can just say like, hey, we just wanted to give you a record of the things that already aren't in perfect condition, so we don't get charged for them when we move out.
Okay, and I like that, the video idea.
Yeah, that's
great.
another way to do it. And then just send it to the
Okay.
landlord so we all have like a timestamp of when it happened, right? Or
Okay,
take pictures of like the 5 things that are weird. If they move into the house and they notice that there's a hole behind the door because someone like opened it, they should take a picture and send it to the landlord before they move in and say, hey, just so you know, like this was here before we moved in. But you
okay,
don't deduct for it after the fact, when we get our security deposit back.
yeah, okay, good, all right, thanks.
Yeah, that's not like a super exciting form. Okay, the last one, guys, we're doing good on time. We may get out of here a little early, is the notice to vacate. This one is not fun, and I'm not going to. We are not lawyers. We are not professional property managers. We don't have errors and omissions insurers that cover us in these respects. Again, if you are representing a landlord, they have decided to own property and put it up for rent, and there is some responsibility on them to know how to be a landlord or to figure it out, right? And if they don't want to do that, then we need to refer them to a professional property manager, because that is not us. We also are not professional property managers. It's just totally different animal with totally different insurance and rules and things we just don't even know about. So, I'm working to see if it would make sense to get like a preferred property management company to refer people to. We have a few people in our company who are brokers who do property management outside of their association with Briggs Freeman. If I can always share those people's names with you if you're interested. Okay, so this is the notice to vacate. If your tenant gets super far behind or is delinquent for some reason, I just used this actually. Unfortunately, I've had really super good luck with all of my tenants for the most part. Every once in a while you get a bad one. But it's a mom and her daughter, and the daughter's adult that has like special needs, and it's just really sad. And they got behind and I like let them, but she kept on saying, I'm gonna pay, and she never did. And finally I went and I delivered this, and you have to deliver this inside the property. And what I did was I delivered it inside the door, and then I put it regular mail, and I put it certified mail return receipt requested, which is like what legal notice is basically. And it says to the tenant from the landlord regarding this lease, you failed to comply for non-payment of rent, and we're terminating your right to property effective blank. Now you can't say one day. There's a minimum number of days. Again, I don't want to pretend like I remember the law accurately. I took that property management seminar literally like 10 years ago. But there's a number of days. I think it has to be at least 3 days. So don't put less than 3 here, but probably your landlord should like look it up and figure out what is the proper law when you're feeling like you might be having to evict someone. Most of the time people will try to get current or just agree to move out, and then you can use that early termination form. This is me being a sucker. So you may have like a more sophisticated, aggressive landlord that like wants to know the law and likes to get 2 people, and to each their own. This is how I do it. But this is basically how this works. So I sent this to her, and then it scared her, and she is paying now, because obviously like we have a finite amount of funds and it's where we choose to spend them. And when I was just letting her get away with it, she just wasn't paying her rent. And then when I said, no, you have to move out, she started paying. Slowly we're getting caught up, and I'm working with her because I'm a sucker and I want them to be able to stay and like have a good place to live and whatever. So obviously you don't want me to be a property manager is the moral of the story. So basically, and then you put down here how. So I said I fixed it to the inside of the main entry door. I certified mailed it, and I regular mailed it. And I did this all on one day. So I checked this box, checked this box, checked this box, printed it out, signed it, put it on the inside of the door, went straight to the post office. Questions? Okay. All right. Well, those are all of our forms. that we were
I had
gonna.
a quick question on that. Sorry, one
Yeah.
of my landlords always ask, like, what if they don't leave? And I kind of just tell me you can call the police afterwards to help escort them out. Is that correct after, a certain amount of days there?
I mean, again, I have never
they always
had to do that. And honestly, when you get that side with sometimes a lot of people I had one where the guy just left and it looked like a bomb went off inside the property. And my poor handyman, God love him, like cleaned it out for me and fixed it up. And we were like, see ya to that guy. So sometimes they'll just, if you have like squatters, you're probably going to have to get an attorney. And I have a good one I can refer you to who's like does this stuff all the time. And I think it's like the sheriff or the constable that helps you like actually move people out. I've literally never had to do that.
I
Usually
have.
Laura has. Laura, tell us about it. Sorry.
Okay, so what you have to do, it's not as simple as you think. You
Mhm.
first have to do an
Very
eviction
complicated.
notice. You have to do an eviction notice. You have to go to the city or the county and file an eviction notice. Then you have to post it on the door 30 days and give them advance. And then they give them an opportunity to go out. I helped a landlord do this. I didn't do it personally. And then, because I drove her everywhere to go, and then you post the thing, and then after 30 days or X number of days, according to the city, then you ask the sheriff to show up with you, and you put their stuff on the side of the street. But it's not you just don't call somebody and say, go evict. It's not that
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah. That's why I'm like, you need an attorney because there's lots of steps. And if you fail to do something properly, then you're in trouble. And if you're with someone who like knows how to work the system and has done this before, then you just need an attorney involved, unfortunately, or someone who's like really good at reading the statutes and figuring out what they need to do. So one thing about that is if people abandon in the lease form that I keep talking about, like it's very clear that if people abandon the property, like everything that's left there, like the landlord can sell it, the landlord can trash it, the landlord can whatever, and then they can like charge the tenant for it. I mean, if someone abandons a property, it's like good luck getting them to send you their funds if their security deposit isn't covered all. But the landlord has a lot of rights if someone like leaves their property there, their personal property. So good question. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions? Thank you for hanging in there.